The year was 1845, and winter lay across the English countryside like a curtain drawn over a forgotten stage. Beyond the drifting snow stood Rosewood Manor, a grand estate whose windows glimmered with distant light, as though it remembered how to shine but no longer wished to. The world outside whispered with wind and frost, yet within those walls lived a silence that felt older than time itself. That silence belonged, in part, to Elise Montclair. Once the cherished daughter of a scholarly nobleman, she had grown amidst books, laughter, and her mother's gentle songs at the piano. But joy is fragile when grief arrives uninvited. When her mother passed away, one bleak spring morning, Elise's world narrowed to a single room and a single truth, without protection. Kindness can fade from memory. Her mother's widower, Lord Reginald Montclair, assumed control with a polite smile that concealed a heart built of calculation. To society, he was refined and respectable. Behind closed doors, he saw Elise not as kin, but as an inconvenience proof of another man's legacy, a legacy that might one day threaten his own bloodline. His daughter, Olivia Montclair, flourished beneath his indulgent gaze and filled the manor with bright dresses, lively conversation, and practiced charm. Elise, however, was banished to the east wing, a corridor. Servants rarely walked, and daylight rarely reached. The excuse given to visitors was delicate health. The truth was far simpler. Out of sight, out of mind. Elise's room held little more than a narrow bed, a cracked mirror, and a worn violin her mother once adored. Each morning she rose with the sound of distant footsteps echoing through the manor. Footsteps that reminded her of the life she once had. She was permitted no lessons, no company. Only occasional meals brought wordlessly by young maids who pitied her more than they dared admit. 10 years passed in this quiet confinement. She learned the language of silence, the refuge of books, and the discipline of hiding one's heart. Yet even silence has a rhythm, and hers carried a trace of defiance, a faint thread of hope. She refused to sever. The servants spoke of her only in whispers, when they were sure no one listened. Some said her eyes held the sorrow of a winter sky. Others said she moved with a grace that lingered long after she left a room, as though she had never quite belonged to this world of dust and obedience. Though isolated, Elise had not forgotten how to think, nor how to listen. She would sit by her frosted window with her violin resting on her lap, gazing toward the grounds where laughter from Olivia and her suitors often drifted through the trees. Sometimes she played a single note, soft, brief, but enlivened for a moment she remembered who she had been before silence claimed her. Lord. Reginald believed obedience was her virtue. Yet obedience, Elise knew, was not virtue when it was born from fear. She carried her thoughts like hidden jewels, polishing them in solitude. Olivia, meanwhile, gathered admirers like petals gather sunlight. She possessed beauty and ambition but lacked compassion. And her laughter, though charming at first, carried a sharpness that revealed its edge. Her father spoke of her future with pride. She would marry into influence, perhaps even nobility. Elise, by contrast, was spoken of as though she had never existed at all. One late afternoon, Elise ventured into the manor's library under pretense of dusting shelves. The room had once been her sanctuary, where she learned poetry beside her mother's patient voice. Now it felt like a relic of a life misplaced. As she reached for a book, she caught sight of her reflection in the polished window, the faint image of a woman she barely recognized. She no longer resembled the girl who used to run across the gardens. Years of confinement had softened her voice but sharpened her perception. She wondered not what life owed her, but whether it still remembered she existed. Before she could dwell in that thought, footsteps approached. She turned to see one of the older servants, a woman named Miriam, whose face held compassion half hidden behind practiced restraint. "You should not linger here," she said kindly. "His lordship has guests arriving tomorrow." Elise nodded, returning a volume to the shelf. "Who comes?" she asked. Miriam hesitated, lowering her voice. "It is said Lord Whitmore, the Duke of Whitmoore, may attend. He is a man of stature, yet unlike the others, they say he keeps his word, and that his heart has withstood both war and fortune." The name lingered like a note Elise could not dismiss. She had never met a duke, nor expected to, yet something in the way Miriam spoke sparked a quiet curiosity. She thanked the maid and retreated to her wing, the corridors stretching before her like a path she had walked 1,000 times and never once escaped. That night, as she sat beside her window, she imagined what kind of man might hold honor in a world ruled by advantage, a man respected for integrity rather than wealth. The idea felt improbable, yet not impossible. There was a part of hers Mall, almost buried, that still believed goodness could exist where power did not corrupt it. The following morning arrived pale and cold, the manor buzzing with preparations for a grand occasion. Servants polished marble floors, arranged garlands, and rehearsed formal greetings. Elise watched from her doorway as crates of flowers and wine were carried past. It was then she learned the truth from a hasty whisper between two maids. Lord Reginald had ordered her to appear during the event not as a guest, but as a server. They said it with sorrow, but Elise only nodded. She had expected nothing more. What surprised her was not the command, but the realization it awakened within her. She no longer feared being seen. She feared remaining unseen forever. She was given a modest gray dress, plain among shimmering gowns, and a silver tray she would carry through the ballroom. When she held it, her hands did not tremble. She stood before the mirror one last time, her reflection faint but present. Her eyes were calm, her posture steady, and though she felt the weight of the years behind her, she sensed something shifting in the air, something she could not name. As snow fell gently against the window panes, Elise whispered to her own reflection, as if testing the strength within her voice. Perhaps the world has not entirely forgotten me. Outside, the first carriage arrived, wheels crunching over frost. Voices echoed through the hall, bright with anticipation. Elise stepped forward, each footfall deliberate. And for the first time in years, she did not flinch from the sound of her own heartbeat. Something waited beyond the doors, not salvation, perhaps, but change. And change, she thought, might be enough to begin again. The night of the Christmas gathering arrived with a quiet grandeur that seemed to breathe life into the stone bones of Rosewood Manor. Snow drifted across, the grounds like scattered silk, softening every edge, while lanterns glowed along the entrance path, guiding carriages toward the open doors. Inside, warmth and clamor replaced the usual silence. Servants hurried through corridors with trays and linens. Candles flickered in wall sconces, and music from the ballroom spilled into every room like a long-forgotten memory. Elise stood in the shadows of the east wing, fastening the simple gray dress across her shoulders. No jewels adorned her. No ribbon tied her hair. Yet when she caught her reflection in the mirror's faint light, she found an unexpected calm. Tonight, she would serve wine, but she would not bow to fear. The ballroom shone like a vision of another world. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of gold across polished marble, and the air carried the scent of pine, cinnamon, and lit fireplaces. Guests arrived in waveslords and dark coats, ladies in silk gowns, officers with medals glinting at their chests. Elise kept close to the wall, balancing a silver tray with steady hands, moving silently between clusters of conversation. She heard snatches of gossip, remarks about suitors, and murmurs about Olivia, who entered at her father's side, radiant in ivory and gold. All eyes followed her as though she were the evening's central flame. Lord Reginald watched with pride, his smile composed but sharp. He surveyed the crowd like a general overseeing a victory, while Elise wove through the guests like a ghost. Some glanced her way, puzzled by the servant with noble posture, but most dismissed her with barely a thought. She moved carefully, gracefully, as though years of solitude had refined her steps into something elegant, without ever seeking admiration. Each moment tested her composure, yet she did not falter. The orchestra began a light waltz. Couples drifted onto the dance floor. Olivia accepted the hand of a young viscount, her laughter bright as bells. Elise observed her sister's ease with people, her talent for making every gaze linger. To Elise, it felt like watching someone perform a role written long ago, rehearsed and perfected, until not even sincerity could be discerned beneath it. She wondered briefly whether Olivia had ever known. Loneliness sore, if privilege had shielded her from the ache of being forgotten. As Elise moved through the crowd, she became aware of the occasional stare following her, not with disdain but curiosity. The servants noticed it too, though none dared speak of it. It was as though the air around her carried a quiet dignity that could not entirely be hidden by plain clothing. She felt the sensation of being seen, fleeting and fragile, yet powerful in the way it made her stand a little straighter. Then, as the musicians transitioned to a slower melody, a hush rippled through the room. It was subtle at first, the faint shift of attention, the pause in a conversation, but it swelled like a tide. Elise followed the direction of the glances and saw him, the Duke of Whitmoore. He stood near the entrance, tall and composed, his dark attire edged with silver. His presence commanded no loud announcement. It simply settled into the room like a long-anticipated truth. Whispers began of his integrity, his years in service, his reputation untouched by scandal. To some, he was a potential ally. To others, a mystery not easily defined. Yet, to Elise, his arrival stirred something deeper, something she could not quite name. As she drifted near the curved stairway, she found a vantage point from which to observe him more closely. He did not appear amused by flattery or impressed by titles. His eyes were steady and discerning, as though weighing character above social standing. When Olivia approached him, curtsying with perfect poise, he greeted her politely, but without warmth. Elise noted the way his gaze lingered not on her sister's beauty, but on the dynamics of the room, the expressions, the silences, the subtle displays of pride and insecurity. She felt his attention shift, almost as if drawn by instinct, and suddenly his eyes found hers across the ballroom. For one fleeting moment, she could not breathe. It was not shock or fear, but the sensation of being understood without words. His gaze held neither pity nor surprise. It held recognition, as though he had expected her all along. She lowered her eyes, her heart unsteady, and resumed her duties with renewed awareness that something had changed. Though nothing outward seemed different at all, Lord Reginald, standing across the room, witnessed the exchange. His jaw tightened, his expression freezing into a mask of polite control. He spoke to a colleague with forced casualness, yet his gaze flickered toward Elise, with a warning sharpened by decades of ambition. He understood the peril of curiosity. A glance from a man of influence could unravel a carefully built illusion. His hand clenched around his glass until the stem nearly snapped. Elise sensed the shift in atmosphere. She stepped back, setting her tray on a table to catch her breath. She listened to the violins, to the laughter that drifted around her, and to the faint sound of her own pulse. She did not search for the Duke's gaze again, but she felt it linger all the same. When she resumed serving the guests, a servant named Miriam passed her with a knowing nod. No words were exchanged. Yet there was a subtle acknowledgment between them that tonight was different from the nights before. As the hour advanced, Elise moved to the far corner of the ballroom near a column carved with ivy motifs. Shadows gathered there, offering a momentary refuge. She watched the dancers glide across the floor with practiced elegance, their smiles poised, their masks unbroken. She wondered how many of them were truly happy, and how many were merely skilled at pretending. Her solitude, though painful at times, spared her the burden of illusion. She closed her eyes for a breath, steadying herself. When she opened them, the Duke was once again watching her not intrusively, but attentively, as though listening to a voice others could not hear. This time he offered the faintest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than greeting. Elise did not return it, yet something within her stirred, quiet. Affirmation that she had not been erased from the world. The ballroom buzzed with speculation. Some guests whispered about the woman in gray, with noble bearing. Others wondered why the Duke seemed uninterested in the daughters of prominent families. Lord Reginald maintained his composure, but his mind raced behind his still expression. He approached Elise quietly, his voice low and stern. "Remember your place," he murmured. "A glance does not grant you standing. Do not confuse curiosity with regard." Elise bowed her head respectfully. "I have forgotten nothing, my lord," she replied with calm restraint. Yet inwardly, she felt the stirring of an idea that had not crossed her mind in years, that her place might not be where he had chosen to keep her. As midnight neared and the music softened, Elise moved to the edge of the ballroom. Snowflakes drifted past the windows like soft sparks against the dark. Across the hall, the Duke turned once more toward her, not forward, not beckoning, but simply as though acknowledging that she existed beyond silence. It was enough to change something within her, subtle but profound. For the first time in a decade, she felt seen, not as a figure of pity, but as a person with dignity still intact. And though no word had passed between them, she sensed that the night had quietly begun a story whose ending could not yet be guessed. The morning after the gathering dawned with a muted stillness, as though the manor itself held its breath over what had silently transpired the night before. Snow blanketed the gardens in an immaculate white, softening the outlines of every hedge and stone, yet the household stirred with an undercurrent of tension. Servants whispered in corners, carrying trays with exaggerated care, as if fearing their footsteps might provoke the walls to listen. Elise descended the corridor with her usual grace, but everywhere she walked, eyes followed her, curious, cautious, and quietly conflicted. Something had changed in Rosewood Manor, not loudly, but undeniably. A moment of recognition, shared across a crowded ballroom, could not be entirely buried beneath polite silence. Lord Reginald appeared at breakfast with a composure that seemed more deliberate than usual. His smile was measured and his tone polished, but the stiffness in his posture betrayed unease. Olivia prattled about the compliments she had received and the letters she expected from potential suitors. But her father barely listened. His thoughts were not on her triumphs. They lingered on the quiet servant girl who had stood beneath the chandelier and, with nothing more than her presence, unsettled the evening. Elise had not defied him, nor spoken out of turn. Yet in simply existing without fear, she had become a risk. He would not admit it aloud, but he sensed danger where others saw none. In the days that followed, Elise continued her tasks dutifully. She cleaned the conservatory, arranged linens, and repaired torn garments with meticulous care. Yet her thoughts were not entirely her own anymore. The Duke's gaze, steady, discerning, had lingered like a note unresolved. It was not affection she felt, nor expectation, but a question that echoed within her. What if silence was no longer her refuge? She had survived in quiet obedience for a decade, but something within her had begun to shift. Like ice cracking beneath slow pressure, it was on a quiet afternoon, as she tended to withering flowers in the conservatory, that she heard footsteps approaching. Expecting a maid, she turned and froze. The Duke stood at the threshold, his hat in hand, his expression carefully composed. He offered a respectful nod. "I was told the Baron would receive me shortly," he said in a low voice. "It appears I have arrived ahead of schedule." Elise steadied herself, brushing soil from her apron. "This room is seldom used by guests," she replied gently. "But perhaps that is why it is worth visiting," he answered. His gaze swept over the wilted blossoms arranged on the table. "You rescue what others discard. That requires patience and a quiet kind of strength." Elise hesitated, uncertain whether to respond. Words were dangerous in a house ruled by cautious ears, yet something in his voice eased her unease. "I only do what I can," she said softly. "Life endures when given a chance, even when others believe it spent." At that, he stepped closer, studying her as though searching for a truth no one else had cared to see. "And what of your own life, Lady Elise? Has it been given such a chance?" The sound of her name startled her. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the second time. They held no pity, only respect. She felt a tremor, not of fear, but of awakening. "I do not expect a chance," she said calmly. "I have learned to live where expectation ends." Their exchange was interrupted by the distant echo of Lord Reginald's voice. Elise stepped back instinctively, as though retreat were a reflex she could not yet unlearn. The Duke did not press further. "You have my apology," he murmured. "I have lingered where caution advises distance." Just before he turned away, he noticed a single snowdrop on the windowsill, fragile blossom with white petals bowed beneath the weight of winter. With care, he lifted it and placed it gently on the table. "This flower," he said, "blooms when all else sleeps. I imagine it is stronger than it appears." Elise watched him leave, her pulse steady yet strange. As though the words had lodged within her like a seed awaiting spring, Lord Reginald greeted his guest promptly, entertaining him in the drawing-room with conversation about trade routes and farm yields. Yet beneath their cordial exchange lay subtle tension. The Duke was courteous but direct, choosing his words with deliberate precision. The Baron masked his suspicion behind practiced civility, observing the younger man with a calculating eye. When the Duke requested to tour the grounds, he complied eagerly, unaware of the true reason. A tour would allow him to gauge the disposition of his guest and perhaps discover what or whom he sought within this house. As they walked the corridors, servants materialized and vanished like shadows. Each bow and curtsy was executed with rigid formality. Elise heard them approach the conservatory once more and braced herself. She set aside her tools and stood quietly as the door opened. Lord Reginald entered first, followed by the Duke, whose expression revealed nothing but calm observation. The Baron gestured toward Elise dismissively. "My late wife's daughter," he said lightly. "She amuses herself with trifles, flowers, and forgotten books. Her talents are modest, but harmless." The Duke regarded Elise without a trace of condescension. "Harmlessness is not a fault, my lord," he replied evenly. "It is often the mark of integrity." Lord Reginald's smile faltered before he recovered it. Elise lowered her eyes, but her heart felt a quiet pulse of defiance. The Duke did not linger long. Yet when he departed, his final glance toward her carried unspoken meaning, as though assuring her she had been seen more truly than her stepfather would ever permit. That night, Elise sat at her window, the snowdrop nestled carefully between pages of a book her mother once read aloud. She turned the pages slowly, letting memory accompany her solitude. For years her silence had preserved her, but now she wondered whether it had also confined her. She touched the fragile petals of the flower, still delicate yet uncrushed, and felt something begin to thaw within her, a notion that survival was not the same as living in the manor's great hall. Lord Reginald spoke with fervor of duty, honor, and legacy. Yet behind his rhetoric, unease simmered. His daughter Olivia, dressed flawlessly, admired widely noticed his distraction. When she asked what troubled him, he dismissed her with a single shake of his head. But he knew the truth. He had worked ruthlessly to erase a presence from his household. And now that presence had become visible in ways he could no longer control. The Duke departed the manor at dusk, his carriage wheels cutting dark lines through the snow. Elise watched from her window, unseen but not unaware. She did not wave, nor did she turn away. Instead, she whispered the name she had heard only in passing Whitmoore, as though testing its sound upon her lips. It did not feel like rescue nor longing. It felt like possibility, which she had almost forgotten how to recognize. As night settled over Rosewood Manor, silence returned once more, but it was no longer the silence of surrender. It felt altered, awakened, as if every room held the faint memory of a question, yet unanswered. Elise closed her eyes and listened to the quiet, not as a shield, but as a promise that perhaps the world beyond her window had begun to listen back. Weeks passed in a hush that felt heavier than silence. Every corridor of Rosewood Manor seemed to harbor an unseen listener, and every glance Elise received carried a new edge, some curious, some resentful, some afraid to truly look at her. Lord Reginald grew more vigilant, his authority poised like a drawn blade. Olivia's laughter lost its ease, sharpened by insecurity she refused to admit. Yet beneath the pressure of the household's shifting tide, Elise felt something within herself begin to anchor. She no longer avoided her reflection. She no longer shrank from others' judgments. The flower pressed into her mother's book, though faded, still remained intact. She had begun to understand that survival did not always mean silence, that dignity could exist even where freedom had been denied. Snow thickened across the land, cloaking the countryside in a muted whiteness. As preparations resumed for the grand Christmas ball, tension threaded the air. Lord Reginald insisted it would be the finest spectacle Rosewood Manor had offered in years, a display of influence and lineage worthy of London's attention. Invitations were sealed with crimson wax. Footmen rehearsed formal greetings. Olivia tried on gowns adorned with pearls and gold thread. Elise continued her quiet tasks, as she always had. But every day she felt the letter hidden beneath her pillow like a heartbeat, steady, undeniable. The Duke's parchment bore no promise of rescue. It's only an invitation, a choice to be made when the time came. The night of the ball arrived under a sky of pewter clouds. Lanterns lined the entrance, wreaths adorned every doorway, and a choir's distant harmonies drifted from the chapel. Carriages arrived in elegant procession, carrying lords, officers, and ladies wrapped in velvet and fur. Elise watched them from the second-floor landing, unseen behind a curtain. She studied their confident gestures, their polished conversations, their effortless belonging. But tonight she felt no envy. Instead, she felt a calm clarity settle within her own, understanding that belonging was not granted by birth, but by courage. She descended the staircase with the same silver tray she had carried weeks before. Dressed in modest gray, hair pinned simply at the back of her neck, servants nodded to her in passing with quiet reverence. They did not need to speak to acknowledge that something about her had changed. She walked with measured steps into the ballroom, where candles shimmered above polished marble. The air smelled of pine and mulled wine. The musicians began a waltz, as if conducting a ceremony no one fully understood. Olivia glided through the crowd like a practiced vision of grace, speaking with noblemen whose eyes were fixed on her beauty, but not her essence. Then the doors opened once more, and the atmosphere shifted as if the room itself inhaled. The Duke of Whitmoore entered not ostentatiously, but with composure that spoke of certainty. Conversations faltered. Some bowed their heads. Others whispered. Elise felt his presence before she saw him. She kept her gaze lowered, reminding herself of restraint. Yet as he crossed the ballroom, her resolve wavered. He moved with calm purpose, not seeking attention, but commanding it all the same. Lord Reginald approached him swiftly, feigning warmth. He spoke of politics, estate affairs, alliances, but the Duke's responses were brief, his attention seemingly elsewhere. Olivia joined them, offering her most graceful curtsy. He acknowledged her politely, yet his eyes drifted across the room, searching. Elise stood near a pillar, half-shadowed, her tray steady in her hands. When his gaze found hers, she felt the truth of her own existence settle like a weight she could finally bear. He began to walk toward her, slow but resolute. Each step drew glances. A murmur rippled through the ballroom, astonishment, disbelief. Elise felt the world narrow around her, yet she did not retreat. Her breath trembled, but her posture remained firm. When he reached her, he bowed with quiet dignity. "Lady Elise," he said softly, "has the world not spoken your name in far too long?" The room held its breath. She whispered, "You must not do this." His voice remained unshaken. "Then let silence be broken." He gently lifted the tray from her hands and set it aside, as though removing the final barrier between existence and acknowledgement. Lord Reginald's fury pierced the hush as he strode forward. "You overstep, sir," he declared, venom behind his civility. "That girl is a servant, nothing more." Eyes across the room turned from shock to intrigue. The Duke did not raise his voice, yet it carried with undeniable clarity. A servant, perhaps, but only because she was denied her rightful place. Nobility is not measured by title, Lord Montclair, but by the humanity one grants others. A silence followed, heavy and momentous. The musicians had fallen still, bowstrings hovering above silence. Olivia's face moved from disbelief to calculation, searching for a way to reclaim control. Lord Reginald stepped closer, his restraint thinning. "You speak dangerously," he warned. "She is unfit to stand before those of status." And yet, the Duke replied, "No one here has stood with such quiet dignity as she." He turned to Elise, offering his hand not in rescue, but in recognition. "If you will join me," he said, "then let the world witness that truth does not hide forever." Elise felt the years of silence press against her like a final test. Her hand trembled at her side. She thought of the conservatory, of the snowdrop that still lay within her mother's book, of every day she had endured, and every night she had stood beneath the window, dreaming of life beyond walls. She understood that stepping forward might mean scandal, exile, or ruin. Yet remaining unseen would mean surrender not just of freedom, but of identity. With steady breath, she placed her hand in his. Gasps scattered through the hall like wind through branches. Some recoiled. Others watched with quiet awe. Lord Reginald lunged forward to stop her, but he found that his authority, once absolute, had begun to fracture. The Duke stood firm. "If dignity is disgrace," he said, "then let us be disgraced together." A single pair of hands began to clap. The Marchioness of Rowan, the most revered guest in attendance, stepped forward with unwavering conviction. "Let honor be honored," she declared. Applause grew uncertain at first. Then, swelling with sincerity, Lord Reginald's face drained of color as he realized his control had slipped beyond recovery. Olivia stood motionless, her beauty suddenly insufficient to command attention. Elise did not gloat. She only held the Duke's hand firmly, her strength no longer hidden. She felt no triumph, only release, as though the years of winter had lifted and a season long denied had finally begun. As the music returned, soft and renewed, the Duke led her from the center of the room toward the ballroom doors. Elise glanced once toward the high windows where snow cascaded gently in the night. For the first time in 10 years, she did not wonder who she might have been. She knew, and though the world might call it scandal, she would call it truth. The doors closed softly behind them, and the night accepted them like a long-awaited dawn. The cold air touched her face, but it no longer felt sharp. Instead, it felt like breath, the first breath of a life finally beginning.